Good morning, everyone. The 8th plenary meeting of the General Assembly is called to order. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Niger to introduce an address by the head of state.
Madam President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I am honored to introduce the pre-recorded statement of His Excellency Mr. Issoufou Mahamadou, President of the Republic of Niger, at the 75th session of the United Nations General Assembly. I thank you very much.
Monsieur le Président,
President, heads of state and government, heads of delegation, ladies and gentlemen. First and foremost, I wish, President, to extend my warmest congratulations to you on your election to preside over this, the 75th session of the United Nations General Assembly. Your personal qualities, your extensive and rich experience, and your leadership are, without a shadow of a doubt, a substantial advantage, which will allow the General Assembly to make progress in fulfilling the mandate bestowed upon it by Member States. I can assure you that Niger stands ready to provide you with all the support you'll need in the fulfillment of your mission. I would also like to pay a well-deserved tribute to the outgoing President, Mr. Tijani Mohamed Bande, and thank him for his leadership of the 74th session, which was marked, as you know, by this unprecedented situation of the COVID-19 pandemic. Finally, I would like to congratulate the Secretary-General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, for the exemplary work that he has done to render our organisation more adept to respond to the needs of our people. They're asking for more solidarity, more security and development. This through the promotion of multilateralism. I welcome his leadership in managing this unprecedented crisis of COVID-19, and particularly his vigorous advocacy for developing countries. He has demonstrated courage in implementing reforms. Niger appreciates his personal commitment for a global ceasefire because of COVID-19 and his climate initiatives, as initiatives also for stability in the Sahel and in West Africa. President, since the 1st of January this year, Niger has been a non-permanent member of the Security Council, and it holds the presidency this month in September. I would like to thank the Member States for this demonstration of trust and esteem that they have shown towards my country. We are working with the members of the Security Council and with all other members of the United Nations to promote international peace and security. The General Assembly is certainly the best forum to communicate directly with the international community. This is why I take this opportunity here to make the solemn announcement that this is the last time that I will be speaking here in my capacity as the President of the Republic of Niger. The next presidential election will be held in December, and it will be an opportunity for the men and women of Niger to choose their new leader. knowing that this is the very first time in its history that Niger will see a democratic transfer of power, this gives me even more pride to announce. These elections will be a decisive moment for Niger. As part of its efforts to broaden its democratic process and consolidate its political maturity. Like other African countries, it is undergoing a democratic transition. Progressively, we are consolidating our democratic institutions, and I have no doubt that ultimately our country will be able to leave far behind it the memories of the vicissitudes that have so long hindered its institutional evolution. This qualitative evolution is the fruit of work carried out over my 2 mandates. Indeed, since the beginning of my first mandate, I ensured that the respect for our constitutional texts and institutions are a cardinal value, a key tenet of my term in office for a renaissance of Niger. My wish was to see Niger go through a transformation on all fronts: political, economic and social. Looking back over the 10 years of the implementation of this Renaissance programme, it has been largely positive. We have built roads, we've brought electricity to villages, we've developed telecommunications infrastructure. We've fed Nigerians thanks to the 3 N's initiative of Nigerians nourishing Nigerians. We've educated and cared for our children. We've promoted access to water and sanitation. And finally, we have created jobs, particularly for young people. Moreover, despite the threats from criminal and terrorist organisations which are causing upheavals around the Sahel and the Lake Chad Basin, we have been able to preserve the integrity of our territory. President, at this time of an international crisis because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the theme that we've chosen for our session is more important than ever. Decisions and consensus is what we expect of the United Nations so that the international community can act in the most effective way possible to overcome together the consequences of the pandemic. It is now the time to follow up on the provisions of the Charter, which stipulated, and strongly so, that the UN was created to serve people. We must therefore reflect on our common future, 75 years after the creation of the United Nations. It is vital that we take measures to make the UN more adept in how it responds to crises that the world is facing at the moment. Democratic governance must be better reflected around the world. We need a multilateralism that is more inclusive, one that listens to developing countries, and one that better reflects the realities of today's world. Thus, we will together be able to build a more effective multilateralism for better global governance. We must build trust. We must develop inclusion and transparency. We must reaffirm our collective commitment to multilateralism. And we must return to resolved action for better effectiveness, representation, responsibility and solidarity. President, the measures taken by the Nigerian government to face down this pandemic has meant that we were able to control the spread and at the same time take the appropriate measures to address the socio-economic impacts. Thus, our response plan includes both the immediate health response and also measures, more broader measures for economic and social mitigation. Key aspects of this have already been implemented, such as the distribution of food, 2 months of free public services for the most vulnerable households, and a temporary fiscal tax break for the sectors that are the most affected. We're also setting up support for the private sector, which takes the form of loan guarantees. COVID-19 is putting our health systems under stress. Indeed, it also has an impact on the responses that we provide to the fight against malaria, tuberculosis, and other tropical diseases that are all too often neglected. Here I wish to reiterate my appeal for a vaccine for all. In addition to the efforts to make a COVID-19 vaccine available, we must also continue to support research for vaccines or even better treatment for diseases such as malaria, cancer, diabetes, and the Ebola virus. In this connection, I am delighted that polio has been officially eradicated in Africa. Moreover, here I wish to welcome, honour and congratulate the healthcare soldiers fighting on the front line in the war against COVID-19. I know that since 2013 we have been celebrating the World Health Week at the start of April every year. This was the WHO's initiative. I also propose that we celebrate an International Day for frontline healthcare workers, given the role that they play in the fight against COVID-19. COVID-19 must mean that we strengthen our investment into healthcare systems, particularly care for women and girls. This is particularly necessary in the African continent, which hosts around 17% of the global population, but only receives 1% of global healthcare spending. It is also important that we rethink access to medication, because, according to WHO figures, 40% of medical products sold in Africa are of poor quality or are counterfeit. The coronavirus pandemic reminds us once again that the global healthcare system is fragile. Coordinated political action is required, action that is decisive and innovative, action that is in partnership with the United Nations and other international organisations. This will allow us to address the COVID-19 pandemic. Vanquishing COVID-19 means that we must involve Africa in the global response based on the African Joint Continental Strategy. I also wish to welcome efforts made by the G20 and by the UN Secretary General, as well as by other partners, to establish a debt moratorium for the most fragile states. Given the current state of urgency, as our countries need financial support that is on the same level as the economic crisis that they are experiencing. A debt moratorium is not sufficient, given the challenges before us. We need to purely and simply cancel this debt and think up and implement a new paradigm to meet the development needs of the poorest countries. The difficulty does not lie so much in thinking up new ideas, but rather escaping from old ones. So said one eminent economist. It's always after crises that the world sees reform. The current paradigm dates from the aftermath of the two oil crises in 1973 and 1979. Its pervasive dominance made us think that this really was the end of history, but it created inequalities to such an extent that the world is, in this field, in its current situation, in the same situation that it was in at the end of the 19th century. We also thought that the financial crisis in 2008 would be an opportunity for reform, but nothing was to come of it. Could the COVID-19 crisis be another opportunity? I sincerely hope so. This crisis must be an opportunity for debate, including on questions that may seem utopian today, such as questions on a global capital tax to fight inequality, on a universal basic income to fight poverty, to a reduction in working hours to fight unemployment, or even opening of borders to better support global economic growth. Some think that this is a pipe dream. The end of slavery, women's emancipation, universal suffrage were also thought of as such. President. To respond to the aspirations of the African peoples, as contained in the Agenda 2063, on behalf of my African peers, I have been piloting since 2017 a new movement towards regional integration with the establishment of the African Continental Free Trade Zone, and the operational phase of this was launched on the 7th of July in 2019 in Niamey. The African Continental Free Trade Zone will allow Africa to establish a single market to support economic growth and to create prosperity through, for example, the creation of jobs for young people, as 10 to 12 million young people arrive every year onto the jobs market. Growth and development in Africa was very promising at the start of 2020. Growth was supposed to go from 2.9% in 2019 to 3.2% in 2020 and 3.5% in 2021. No small progress had been made in the reduction of poverty and in terms of healthcare indicators. COVID-19 blew this spark out, and many of our countries will find themselves in recession. Before COVID-19, Africa needed $600 billion a year to meet the SDGs. Certainly this figure will increase now. The pandemic, therefore, demands that we strengthen our bilateral, regional and interregional partnerships. Demands also that we develop better coordination, both with United Nations agencies and with international financial institutions. It is high time to further strengthen the ties between peace, security broadly, and development. The question here is to tackle together a global state of emergency. It is a state of emergency that is health-related, it's economic, it's social, it's a climate emergency and a security emergency too. Niger is convinced that the numerous threats that are weighing over international peace and security cannot be solved by states individually, but through collective action on the part of the international community. Here I would like to pay particular tribute to the valiant peacekeepers and those working for defence and security forces who have fallen in the battlefield, particularly in Sahel and in the Lake Chad Basin. We welcome the operational and intelligence capacity building of the defence and security forces on a national level, of the operation of the multinational joint force in the Lake Chad Basin and the joint force of the G5 Sahel. For sustainable funding of this, I welcome the proposal of our Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, who recommends that we take inspiration from the model provided by AMISOM, the African Union mission in Somalia. Also, the creation of a coalition to fight terrorism in the Sahel, and the establishment of a joint command for all forces participating in Barkhane and Takuba, and the upcoming deployment by the African Union of 3,000 troops, as well as initiatives of ECOWAS. All of these are sources of hope. Hope that we will soon be victorious over our common enemy, terrorism and organised crime. Here I wish to share our concern as regards how the situation is evolving in Mali, particularly following the coup that took place in Mali on the 18th of August last. Niger and the other countries of ECOWAS are fully committed to seek and find a solution to address the crisis in Mali. This requires soldiers to return to their barracks and for a transition to be led by the civilian authorities. In Mali and throughout the G5 Sahel region, we need multilateralism in order to pursue our fight against terrorism in all its forms, duly taking into account the women and youth dimensions, because terrorism feeds on poverty. Children are amongst the first victims of terrorist attacks which target schools in the central Sahel region, where thousands of children are being deprived of their education. Though it wasn't our region that created these evils. They were thrust upon us. Our region is a victim. That is to say that the security threat that is ravaging the Sahel is not just a local problem, but an issue of global concern. The efforts of the Sahel states must be supported both bilaterally and multilaterally. Here I also wish to welcome and honour the sacrifices made by humanitarian workers. I know that Resolution 2175 from 2014 protects them, but this protection must be strengthened. A mechanism for oversight and communication of information and sanctions concerning attacks on humanitarian workers must be established too. President, since the Abidjan summit, a partnership between Africa and Europe has gone on to a new level. This has allowed the two continents to jointly define their priorities. It is using this more innovative and inclusive approach that the trilateral UN-AU-EU group was established in order to address the dramatic situation faced by African migrants in detention centres in Libya. Here I wish to reaffirm Niger's solidarity towards our brotherly people in Libya who have been subjected to unutterable sufferance for around 10 years now. It is regrettable that the initially promising conclusions from the Berlin Conference under the leadership of Chancellor Merkel were not respected by the very people who adopted them. As we look for a solution to this crisis, the role of the African Union and neighbouring countries of Libya must not be sidelined. We very much look forward to a inter-Libyan National Reconciliation Conference take place so that we can prioritise a political solution to this crisis. We also wish to see a special envoy, a joint UN-AU special envoy for Libya. Elsewhere in the world, the situations in Syria, Myanmar, Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, and in the Middle Eastern region. Here, Niger is actively participating in efforts of the international community to foster peace and security for the people around the world. On the Palestinian question, Niger believes that a lasting solution to this issue necessitates talks between Israel and Palestine on the just and unanimously accepted basis that is a two-state solution, Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security within 1967 borders and in line with relevant Security Council resolutions. In this time of our pandemic, we will express our solidarity with the Palestinian people. We're strengthening UNRWA in its work to protect the most vulnerable Palestinians. We extend this solidarity to all countries in crisis. This is why we support the appeal of the United Nations Secretary General for a suspension or lifting of unilateral coercive measures which could hinder the capacity of states to effectively tackle the COVID-19 pandemic and to respond to the needs of their people. President, COVID-19 is making us think about the world we want to build. What do we want the post-COVID-19 world to look like? What relationship do we want to have with our planet? The response to these questions are, as I said earlier, cover fields of healthcare, the economy, humanitarian issues, and policy. Every year, Niger loses around 100,000 hectares of arable land, which means that our people find themselves facing food insecurity. We must therefore protect land and ecosystems. Both of these are vital for human life. It is high time to create a new social contract for nature on a global scale. So that we can better recover from this crisis, we must also align our strategies for the SDGs and the Agenda 2030 and create a sustainable and inclusive economy and also reducing the risk of future crises. Our lifestyles and our modes of consumption have a substantial impact on the planet and on the use of resources. It is vital that we change this. This is why, in Africa, we are working with the Climate Commission for the Sahel region that I am honoured to chair for the implementation of the Paris Agreement around Africa. It is with this in mind that we drew up a global climate investment plan for the Sahel region, covering the period of 2018 to 2030. This is now a useful tool to boost the implementation of the Paris Agreement around the region. Along the same vein, the Great Green Wall Initiative has also allowed us to build a more sustainable and equitable future and to give life to our vision of being neutral in terms of land degradation. By keeping our land healthy and by prioritising nature-based solutions, we will also be able to preserve as well our people's health. President, a century ago, when the Spanish influenza struck a world already destroyed by the Great War, very few multilateral institutions existed. Countries tackled the pandemic with means that we didn't have today, and they learnt a lot from this. Today, the World Health Organization has become the most relevant multilateral framework that we have at our disposal. And it allows us to take concerted action to tackle epidemics. Other multilateral institutions, such as the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, and the IMF, are also tools that allow us to build our collective capacity to solve global problems. We urge Member States to support the efforts of the Secretary-General to reform the organisation and to strengthen its role and to give it the capacity to allow it to fulfil its mission adequately. Niger once again reiterates its commitment to the common African position as enshrined in the Eswatini Consensus. The multilateral system that was born after the Second World War allowed us to define and implement norms and principles that were based on human development. Today, the respect for the individual, the defence of freedom, the fight against poverty or epidemics are the priorities of the global multilateral system. Beyond institutional reform now, it is also within our societies that we can win this fight through far-reaching changes of our behaviour and our policies. We must invent an economy that respects human beings and the environment. President, the 75th anniversary of the United Nations is the opportunity for us to reflect on how we can make the UN more adept in how it addresses new challenges. We must preserve what we have gained thanks to multilateralism. If the international system continues to be perceived as unjust and unequal, if we do not ensure that law has primacy over force, if we do not meet the needs of our citizens, then there will be more and more causes of instability and ideological hostility towards global governance and democratic models will flourish. The multilateral world cannot be exclusively supported by a power struggle between great powers. This is why, perhaps, President, the most important lesson that we've learned from the COVID-19 has already been spoken. In this spirit, I would like to recall the words of Dag Hammarskjöld, who said that the UN was not created to take mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell. Today, we need a more agile, more democratic, more coordinated and effective UN. A UN that leads us to a safer, more inclusive and sustainable world. I would, to conclude, like to take inspiration from the famous phrase of Thucydides. They are worthy of praise who are more just than their present power requires of them. Being more just also means do everything we can to avoid falling into this trap and to protect humanity from a global confrontation with irreparable consequences. We need to strike a new global balance. This is the opportunity that COVID-19 is giving us. I thank you very much for your kind attention.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Niger for the statement just made.